So there's less and less room for normal people in this economy, and that's how it feels, and for a lot of families, that's how it is. More folks are living paycheck to paycheck, cutting back, doing everything right, and still falling behind. People look at a headline like consumer spending is up and think, see, things are fine, but if you're the one paying all the bills, how do you know the truth? Spending is up because the price of everything you need just keeps rising. Okay, it's not luxury, it's survival. We keep hearing that the consumer is resilient. Well, let me translate that. The consumer is stretched. Groceries, utilities, insurance, taxes, every line item found a way to creep higher at the same time. And while that's happening, the raise that used to give us breathing room barely covers the last year's increase. So yeah, the register rings, but the mood, consumer sentiment is low because people aren't buying joy, they're buying time. They're buying one more month with the lights on, one more week with the fridge full, one more day before the car note is due. Okay, have you noticed the little shocks lately? You know what I'm talking about. Okay, your health insurance quietly jumped by 100 or two, your property tax popped, your car insurance got re-rated. None of these are optional. Okay, these are the kind of increases that breaks a budget that was already precise down to the dollar. Okay, we make a mistake when we treat this like a unique American problem, but it's not. Okay, this cost of living squeeze is global, but America exports culture, habits, and trends. Okay, keeping up, swapping phones every year, financing the lifestyle. So when the bills come, it ripples. Okay, the same way the American consumer economy taught the world to want more, the American cost of living crisis is teaching the world what it costs to want more when wages just don't keep up. Look around, okay, you'll see it. Okay, the old shopping patterns are fading, car sales slip, home sales slow. Not because people suddenly hate cars or homes, because the numbers just don't work. Okay, even the big investors see it. Okay, when private firms decide that building a new single development isn't worth it, and instead they hunt for older houses to buy up because new builds are expensive. That tells you something about the structure of cost in this moment. Okay, it's not just you, it's math. Okay, when you look at how high the interest rates, you see, people are paying a lot more. When the interest rates go up, people's salaries don't go up. It's not increasing at the same rate. People sometimes say, well, we'll just rent. Well, who are you renting from? Someone who pays insurance, taxes, maintenance, and wants a return. So the rents, the rent chased the same cost. Now you're paying a mortgage, sized bill without building equity. For a while that imbalance can hold, but not forever. You have a system that treats shelter as a speculative asset, first, and a human needs second. Will eventually meet the limit of household budgets. And then there's job stories that make your stomach drop. One month you're on a six-figure salary, the next you're piecing together side gigs and bringing in less than your old mortgage payment. That's not a moral failure. That's a mismatch between how fast your fixed expenses updated to the new normal and how slow your income can adapt when the ladder you were climbing suddenly gets pulled. Look at math millions of families are doing. A mortgage in $3,000 to $4,000 range. Annualized, that's 35 to 50 grand before you count food, gas, insurance, childcare, phones. Random emergencies that always arrives because something's always got to get fixed. It's always something. It's always something that needs to be renewed, needs to get fixed. a basic family budget around, 80,000 a year just to hold steady isn't some luxury lifestyle. That's survival for a lot of zip codes. Now put that next to a medium household income in mid 70s. You see why the mood is dark. Even when the mall looks crowded, people try to fill the gap with personal discipline, coupons, loyalty apps, cutting, streaming, cutting eating out. It helps, but there's a hard ceiling to how much you can save your way, when the big four, housing, food, transportation, healthcare, move together. They're all going up. Okay, you could be the most disciplined person on earth and still get wiped out by a premium hike, a rent increase, a property tax adjustment, or a sudden repair. I mean, right now, just your basics all going up, continuously going up. And it's tough pill to swallow. We're also told, just work more, monetize the spare hours, turn your life into side hustles. Okay, some do, many already did, but they're only 24 hours in a day, and most households won't hit 150,000 a year, no matter how many apps they juggle. That isn't laziness. That's just the shape of wages in the real economy. So if you're feeling this problem, okay, it's bigger than stop buying lattes or just cut back on a little bit. It's not you being irresponsible. This is the system that's being created. This is the modern reality. Choices matter, but choices are marginal against structural cost. You can tighten your belt all you want and still get crushed. If your baseline jumps $300 a month because your insurance company recalculated risk, or your county reassessed values, when your fixed expenses are indexed to a system that raises prices faster than your raise, discipline becomes triage. There's another layer we don't talk about. Okay, we're also talking about policy choices that raise prices through the supply chain and get spread across everything. You got tariffs. A simple example. You can agree or disagree, with them on principle, but down the aisle, they land on the shelf as a higher number. Companies don't eat those costs. They average them out across the catalog. Okay, so you're paying it. Okay, you don't always see it labeled, but you feel it anyways. Meanwhile, financial markets sometimes cheer, okay, the very pain you're living. Bad jobs report, stocks pop, because maybe that means interest rates will fall. But even if interest rates drop, most households won't suddenly qualify for the house they couldn't afford last week. Lenders still look at ratios. Budgets are still tight. Lower doesn't automatically mean accessible. So what happens if the markets bet on a spending spurge that never shows up? We've seen this movie. The profits don't materialize, the charts roll over, and somehow the bill finds its way back to the same place it always does. Okay, the public, bailouts, emergency programs, new liquidity. Okay, the kind of moves that keep big systems from seizing up, but also push more money into circulation at the same time. Households are already chasing higher prices. So the rest. Cost of good rises, the cost of rent rises, the cost of survival rises, and your paycheck feels lighter even when the numbers on it haven't changed. So why do we practically, realistically, what do we do? While people in charge argue about charts, first we take back the places we actually control. Start with food, okay? Buy ingredients, not just items. If the cart is full, packaged convenience, you're literally paying for other people's time. Learn 3 cheap, repeatable meals you can cook in your sleep. Rice, beans, eggs, whole chicken, seasonal produce, bulk spices. Boring is powerful, but when times are tight, got to do what you got to do. I walked into local markets where prices felt like stepping 15 years back in time. When you can, buy closer to the source. Real food stretches. Second, rebuild the community economy. Split wholesale club purchases with neighbors. Start a weekly swap for kid clothes. Uh, Tool share for repairs. Ride share for practices. The math changes when 5 families stop acting like 5 islands. That's not utopia. That's just plain arithmetic. So third, you got to cut the finance taxes on your life. Call the insurance company and ask the re-rate. Audit subscriptions ruthlessly. That's how they get you. Refinance the small stuff before it becomes big stuff. If you have debt, step into attack mode and order of interest rate. If you don't, build a real emergency fund. 3 to 6 months is a classic advice. Even one, honest month is life-changing when a surprise hits. So fourth, rethink the upgrade reflex. The newest phone on a payment plan is very expensive habit disguised as 10 easy dollars. The newest car rates, they're lower, still a giant principle, at today's prices. Stretch what you have, make good enough, your power move. And fifth, diversify how you learn to earn. I'm not telling you to day trade your way to freedom. I'm saying, pick one skill that can sell on a Saturday. Repair, tutoring, basic editing, cleaning, translating, hauling, handyman work, and get good enough that your name gets passed around. If the main job wobbles, you're not starting from zero. And then there's the bigger mindset shift. Stop waiting for permission to build small local stability. Big problems are real, but local wins compound. If you can lower your household burn rate by 200 a month and increase your side income by 200 a month, that's $400 swing. Over a year, that's nearly $5,000. Over 3 years, okay, that's a used car. You don't have to finance or, a cushion that keeps you from a bad week from becoming a bad year. So people ask, should I invest when everything feels shaky? The honest answer is take care of the foundation first. If you're juggling high interest debt and sweating rent, you don't need the stress of timing markets. Okay, your best return might be debt elimination, skill stacking and durable goods that reduce monthly costs. If you're stable and you choose to invest, do it with a plan that doesn't depend on guessing headlines. Automate, diversify, and forget the drama. If you're looking at precious metals as insurance, understand what insurance is. It's there if you need it, not a lottery ticket. So underneath all the tactics is something deeper. Refusing to internalize a lie. You're not failing because eggs are more expensive. You're not failing because your country raised the assessment. You're not failing because the algorithm told you everyone else is thriving while you're clipping coupons. You're living a system that asks households to absorb shock. They didn't create. Then they call it resilience, when they don't collapse. So this channel started with a simple message. If you don't know who I am, I'm Expat D, the California refugee. I've been living abroad, and it's an option, still is. For some of you, a move will make the math and the move better. Many people here have already done it and haven't looked back. For others, and rebuilding where you are is the right call. There isn't one path to dignity, there's many. So here's what I want you to take from this. Stop pretending. Okay? Stop pretending the squeeze is your personal flaw. Name it, adjust to it, push back where you can. Build tiny systems that make your household harder to break. Cook more, share more, learn one new sellable skill, cut one fixed expense for good. Talk to your neighbors and keep your hope practical. Not the kind that waits for a savior headline, but the kind that stacks small wins until the big picture shifts. And if you're still with me, drop one concrete move you're making this month. A recipe rotation, a budget change, a side skill, a market you found with better prices, a neighbor you teamed up with. Your comment might be the idea someone else needed to hear. So thanks for listening. Take care of yourself, take care of your people. And remember, you're not in this alone. So I'll see you in the next video. Like, share, subscribe, and let's get this channel to grow. I'm Expat D, the California refugee. All right, I'm going to end it here, and I'm going to say peace for now.